Let's break the political talk show mold. Anything worth doing is hard, and that includes being a good citizen. Our mission is to help you be that better citizen by letting you hear about stuff you might not know, which will make everyone think you're so smart, or by giving you a chance to listen to interviews and debates on a wide variety of subjects that might actually allow you to form new opinions in the privacy of your own mind. I'm Justin Oldham, and you are listening to the Politics and Patriotism Show here on the Stitcher Smart Radio Network. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another historical edition of the Politics and Patriotism Show. Now, we bang the drum a lot around here about the importance of being a better citizen. So, with that in mind, I'd like to bring you a conversation that I recently had with author Justin Martin, who's going to tell us a story about somebody who was a better citizen. And this is no ordinary story. This is, in fact, the real-life biographical history of one Frederick Law Olmstead, who happens to be one of America's founding landscape architects. Now, don't be so quick to hit the pause button, because there's more to this guy than meets the eye, and I wouldn't waste your time with a boring discussion on just any old thing. In addition to being the aforementioned outdoor aesthetics expert, Olmstead was a good citizen. He made contributions to the anti-slavery movement in the years leading up to the Civil War that may just surprise you. He's one of those people that proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that the pen really is mightier than the sword. And that's no small thing in light of what you're going to hear this author say about Frederick Olmstead's Civil War record. I mean, what that man did during the American Civil War is largely unknown by most people, and yet it was very important to the outcome of many battles, and it saved many lives. The sum total of everything you're about to hear in this one-hour program bears out the fact that, in historical terms, one person in the right place at the right time can make all the difference. And they don't always have to be a soldier. So, without any further suspense, here is author Justin Martin talking about his latest book, Genius of Place, The Life of a Frederick Law Olmstead, published by DeCapo Press in October of 2012.
My name is Justin Martin. I'm a writer. I grew up in Kansas City and moved to New York, as many writers do. I worked for Fortune magazine for a while before going off to write books. I wrote a biography of Alan Greenspan, the one-time Fed chairman, and also a biography of Ralph Nader, the consumer advocate. Both of those were living figures, and of course found it sort of a challenge to chase them down. So I decided for my next project, my current one, to look toward a deceased figure. So I picked Frederick Law Olmstead. Olmstead designed Central Park in New York City, a place where I spent a lot of time when I first arrived in New York, long before I knew anything about my subject, a place where I used to hang out and play Frisbee, a place where I ultimately got married. And so as time moved along, I became more and more interested in Frederick Law Olmstead, and he struck me as a great biography subject.
Before we start talking about this man's history, let's set out a few parameters here, because I think we're going to be talking about a few subjects which are not common knowledge to the average person. So I would like you to start by answering the big picture question that you ask at the beginning of your book. Why does Olmstead matter?
The reason Olmstead matters is because not only did he shape the landscape as a landscape architect, designing parks and the grounds of universities and grand private estates, which is the Biltmore Estate out in North Carolina, but he also had a huge impact on the cultural landscape of 19th century America in ways that continue to reverberate to the present.
Let's talk about what landscape architecture is for a moment. Just give us the brief 101 on that so that everybody knows what you're talking about.
Landscape architecture is one of those things that's difficult to define, but maybe the best way to define it is you've got landscaping, which of course is working with, everybody knows landscapers, people who come out and help one get their garden in shape and maybe trim a few trees and so forth. Landscape architecture is simply that on a grand scale, and it's really conceptualizing big pieces of land, parks, the grounds of public buildings, the grounds of universities. And so it's a discipline that pulls together a knowledge of botany and a knowledge of dendrology, the study of trees, along with one needs to really have an idea of how to put a bridge or a refectory or water element such as a pool into such a landscape that will make it really be useful and attractive to people.
Part of what's so interesting to me is that this goes down as one of the American firsts, because you said the D word, the discipline. And this is a guy who does all of this without a university education. There is no school of landscapeology for him to go to. He is one of the principal inventors of this field.
You're exactly right. Frederick Law Olmstead, when he came onto the scene in the 1850s, there were hardly any trained architects in the United States, let alone trained landscape architects. And so he really is the U.S. pioneer in this field. Now, he was drawing on, there have been landscape architects for centuries, certainly designing parks in England and the grounds of palaces in China and so forth. So he was certainly drawing on an ancient discipline. But America, of course, was a new country, and so the very idea of landscaping large pieces of land was novel. And as I said, Olmsted really is the pioneer of landscape architecture in the United States.
Now, this matters to me because as a visually impaired person, my environment has a larger impact on me than even I realize at times, because my limited eyesight means that when I walk into a room or in a building or anything, my brain is processing what few details I can see. So they stand out to me, I think, more than they do to the average person. So I have realized from a very young age that a happy place can make me feel happy, and a miserable place can make me feel miserable. And the same thing is true both indoors and outdoors. And I think it's interesting that he comes to figure that out so early in life.
So very true. I mean, Olmsted was somebody that from a very early age, though he did not know it, he was kind of being trained for his ultimate career as a landscape architect. One detail I found really striking when I was doing my research was that as a young man growing up in Hartford, Connecticut, he and his family used to go out into the countryside surrounding Hartford, and they would just take these very silent horseback rides. The whole family didn't speak, and they just looked around at nature and were just kind of awed by its beauty. And that really, those silent horseback rides as a young boy really shaped Olmsted and started him on the road to ultimately becoming a landscape architect. And as a landscape architect, as you mentioned, he was really just a master at creating spaces that people interact with and experience, often without even realizing how or why these spaces are acting upon them. And basically, people have the experience Olmsted wanted them to have when they visit his various landscapes. Central Park is a fantastic example. You don't have to know a thing about Frederick Olmsted. You don't have to know his name. But if you're in the park, there are all kinds of elements and details he put in place that sort of guide people through the park and cause them to have certain experiences of wonder or magic or what have you, that he's put in place, basically.
Now, when I was in college, I met my fair share of architect majors, and they were studying art and sculpture and philosophy and a wide range of what we would call soft sciences. And contrast that with Olmsted's beginnings. This guy is lightning in a bottle and jack of all trades, master of none. So let's go ahead and start with that. But I want to ask one question up front. How much of a genius was he really? Because we were all unfocused in our youth, and I can see how a genius born into a parochial environment would be a terribly frustrated person and awfully hard to deal with in the first place. So how much of his early recalcitrance was just him being a wild child, and how much of that was his real genius?
I think of him as being, that's an excellent question. I think of him as being a genius even from early on, from the standpoint that he had a sort of a sense of destiny, something that not everybody has. He knew that he was slated for grand things. And so as a young man, he tried all different things. I often think of him as a jack of all trades, and not necessarily a master of none. He actually was someone who did many things and often did them very well. I mean, he was a professional journalist for the New York Times, and had he not gone on to landscape architecture, he would have been a historical footnote for the superb reporting he did for the Times. So he was a person who did many things and did them well, but he also had an incredible restlessness. When he'd take on some new endeavor, if it didn't promise to deliver him to this grand fate that he believed he had, he would quickly move on. So it made him very kind of scattershot, but ultimately he did find his way to something so unusual, so unexpected, given, for him, he found his way to landscape architecture, and sure enough, that was where he was really able to exercise all of his great complement of skills and really have his genius blossom.
Okay, let's go through the chronology here. Now, start with his early education, because this is something that needs to be put into context for a lot of our listeners. I have a background in history. It makes perfectly good sense to me. I'm familiar especially with East Coast cultures, but when they read about the type of schooling that he gets in his early life, it's going to seem rather quirky and strange that his parents would send him to one parson after another who was trying to run a school on a farm at the same time. So explain why that made sense in the context of its day.
Sure. Well, a couple things to bear in mind. Olmstead was born into a pretty well-to-do family. His father was a dry goods merchant, and when Olmstead was a young man, his mother died. And so his father remarried, and they started a new family. And pretty soon the house was pretty crowded with brothers and sisters. I guess they'd be half-brothers and sisters. And so the family decided that they would send Olmstead away for his schooling, which was not unusual in that era. It was not unusual to send a kid away. And furthermore, his stepmother, who was very devout, decided it would make sense for him to pursue his schooling with various country parsons who would kind of help him not only to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also would help him to become a more godly and faithful person. And so what happened was Olmstead was sent away to a whole series of arrangements where these country parsons would also, they were very poor often, and so they ran little schools, but they also ran farms on the side to make extra money. And then, of course, they also had their parsonage duties. And Olmstead just completely abused these situations. He'd sneak out of the parsonages and wander around the countryside. He was a kind of a disciplinary problem, staying up late into the evening, sort of distracting the other students. And so it's at country parsonage after country parsonage, Olmstead failed to pass muster, and so they'd have to move him along to a new country parsonage, basically.
I'm Luke Herbert, and this program is supported by SafeNetRadio.com.
Okay, now I have heard it said many times that failure brings wisdom. And just to illustrate that point, some of the very best policemen that we have ever had in our society have been former criminals. So it's not that hard to see how, as he's going through this early period in his life, he is seeing so many different farms, which in many cases are not being run that well, and he is seeing so many different aspects of the land that whether he realizes that he's being plugged into these things or not, that as his adult mind begins to form, as he begins to mature, as his cognitive processes comes into being, he starts to distinguish what works and what doesn't. That I can begin to see that. And so when he finally gets his first desk job, as miserable as he is, it's noteworthy that the administrative skills that he is taught there, as much of a drudge as it is, they are useful for the rest of his life.
No, very true. He went from he had a whole series of different. He started out going to these various poor country schools. He left school at the age of 14 because he had an attack of poison sumac that spread into his eyes. From there, he tried being a surveyor. From being a surveyor, he tried being a clerk in Manhattan. After trying to be a clerk, he became a sailor briefly and sailed to China and back. On return from that, he became a farmer. So he did a whole series of things, whole series of different jobs. And all along the way, he was kind of absorbing landscape in one capacity or another, certainly as a surveyor, certainly as a farmer. But of course, he hadn't yet found a vehicle for really sort of delivering his ideas.
Now, one of the things that I am told about landscape architecture in particular is that because it borrows from so many things, it requires exposure to so many different things. So as we look at the different styles of a farming that he encounters, and it's also important, I think, to look at the different styles of people that he encounters. So talk to us about the man at Fairmont who taught him really what he needed to know about scientific farming before he jumps out there and convinces his dad to spend all that money.
Sure. Well, Olmstead at a certain point he decided he wanted to become a farmer, and becoming a farmer was a common profession in 19th century America. About 70% of the population was involved in agriculture. But about this time, Olmstead was also, about the time he was thinking about becoming a farmer, he was also feeling the very first pangs of a very, very distinct attribute of people who came of age in the 1840s as he did. And that was he was starting to feel the first pangs of a kind of social conscience. He wanted to be a reformer in some capacity. And this was a very common feeling, just as people who grew up in the 1960s in America have certain attributes, people who grew up in America and came of age in the 1840s had certain attributes. They wanted to be reformers often, and that particular generation had all kinds of innovations in the field of social reform related to mental health, for treating the mentally ill, for treating handicapped people, and so forth. When Olmstead's case, interestingly, he decided to apply that idealism to farming. And now, as I described, Olmstead wasn't very well educated, but he was extremely well read. And what he resolved he was going to do was he was going to read the latest scientific journals, and he would glean the best practices in farming, and then he would disseminate the information to his fellow farmers, many of whom were illiterate. And that way he could act in a kind of social reform capacity. So he identified a man, as you mentioned earlier, who received a commendation for running a model scientific farm, and he arranged to serve an apprenticeship under him. George Geddes is the scientific farmer who worked with Olmstead, who Olmstead served an apprenticeship under, and he's a very important figure in upstate New York. In fact, his father had been involved in the founding of the Erie Canal.
Now, I think back on my own life and the very small number of people who fill that sort of role, and it's you can think of it as providential, if you will, but you did frame the whole thing quite well. The 1840s were a period of such tremendous innovation. I'm curious to know, in what respects were George Geddes like Fred Olmstead? Because it seems like just that one particular stretch of the book, it seems like these guys are, while they may have been temperamentally different, they were on such a similar trajectory for such a brief period of time that what he learned from that man was such a profound influence on his life that you have to wonder what he would have achieved without it.
George Geddes, and the time Olmstead spent with him as an apprenticeship on his scientific farm was essential. George Geddes was kind of an ideal for Olmstead. Geddes was a gentleman farmer who who was doing good in the community. Some of the things Geddes was involved in seem almost self-evident now, but this was a very different time. For instance, Geddes was involved in getting a plank road laid from up near Syracuse, where the farm was, to some of the neighboring towns, such as Syracuse. And this would allow this was an act of sort of communal spirit. It helped the fellow farmers or in the community where George Geddes lived to be able to convey their goods to market. And so Olmsted was very, very taken with Geddes. He really was impressed with the way that Geddes was sort of civic-minded, the way that he helped his fellow farmers. Olmsted was also certainly impressed with the fact that Geddes was a very successful farmer. He was able to eat exotic things that were grown on his land, such as pineapples, and Olmsted was quite excited by that. Olmsted liked the idea, it's a very 19th century notion of sort of noblesse oblige. Olmsted hoped he himself would become at that point would become a wealthy country squire who would be helping out his fellow farmers.
Yes, but other things lay in his future, to be sure. Now, his first farm certainly doesn't work out like that. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. But great things come from small beginnings. So let's talk about that first farm.
Sure. Well, Olmsted just became fixated. After serving this apprenticeship under Geddes, Olmsted just became fixated. Olmsted was from Connecticut. That's where he grew up. And so he became fixated on having a Connecticut seaside farm. That was just his notion. That was what he was going to have. And his father was going to be the one who bought the farm. So Olmsted went and picked a pretty godforsaken property that had been pretty abused. I mean, I believe potatoes had been growing there season after season. The land was leached of its nutrients. But Olmsted was coming at this with his idealism. He thought he could become George Geddes, the country squire on this wretched piece of land. And it was very quickly there was a collision between Olmsted's idealism and the reality of this piece of land. Olmsted found it very difficult to raise crops. The farmhouse that he'd purchased the clapboards were all warped and there were holes in them, and the winter wind blew through off the Long Island Sound, and it was really quite a miserable experience. And in classic young Olmstedian fashion, he very quickly became frustrated. Even though there had been nothing he'd wanted more than a Connecticut seaside farm, he soon became convinced that a farm in the more attractive land of Staten Island, New York, was more to his liking. And so what Olmsted did was, his poor father, who was always very supportive of him, took the farm off his hands, sold it at a loss, and meantime purchased him a new farm on Staten Island.
That move to the Staten Island neighborhood was, to me, as a historian, one of the more fascinating pieces of the story, because he moves into an area that is just rich with historical characters.
Yes, it was. Olmsted, the move to Staten Island was essential. First of all, Staten Island in this era was just an island off the tip of Manhattan, Olmsted was a ferry ride away from one of the great commerce and intellectual centers of the world at that time. Olmsted also, as it happened, Staten Island had had a sizable Dutch contingent in that era, and his neighbors had Dutch names like Van Goyen and other Dutch names that many people might recognize, like Vanderbilt. This was where the Vanderbilts, who many of whom lived in nice apartments on Fifth Avenue. They often had their country farms out on Staten Island, which was kind of their hereditary home from when they'd come to this country from the Netherlands. And in fact, one of the really fascinating things I discovered in my research was, while he was a farmer on Staten Island, Olmsted actually was called upon to do his very first landscape architecture projects for some of the Vanderbilts. Now, he didn't call it landscape architecture. Olmsted didn't. What happened was Olmsted took his own farm on Staten Island. He did some sort of attractive things, moved the farmhouse so he'd have the farmhouse itself so he'd have a better view of out onto Raritan Bay, had a nice winding road up to the farmhouse. So some of the Vanderbilts saw that Olmsted had made these nice changes to his farm, and they hired him to landscape their farms. And so that in effect were the very first, years before Central Park, really about 15 years before he worked on Central Park, his first project, those really represent the first landscape, sort of forays into landscape architecture for Olmsted.
Yes, and then of course he gets another neighbor, a neighbor by the name of Putnam.
That is right. Yes, Olmsted. One of Olmsted's neighbors was a weekend hobby farmer named George Putnam. That's another name that might be resonant for listeners. He's a publisher who spent the weeks in Manhattan working on his publishing company and would go out on weekends to his Staten Island farm and kind of putter around. And Putnam was an incredible innovator as a publisher. His publishing house is still around to this day, and he's one of the very first people ever to publish paperback books. And so Putnam asked Olmsted. Olmsted had, at this point, he'd recently taken a walking tour across England with his brother, and he'd taken this walking tour ostensibly to witness or to become exposed to British agricultural practices. Now, when he returned from England to Staten Island, his neighboring farmer on Staten Island, George Putnam, asked him if he'd be interested in writing a paperback book about his recent walking tour across England. So Olmsted produced a book called Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. Now, the book was not very well met. The reviews were very tepid. The sales were very slow. But suddenly Olmsted, this guy who had done all these different things, he'd been a surveyor, he'd been a clerk in a shipping firm, he'd taken an ocean voyage, he'd been a farmer. All of a sudden, he made the transition to being a writer.
You know, it's important for people to understand here in the 21st century that this is the inventor of the paperback book fishing around for somebody who's willing to take part in the experiment because nobody knows if it's going to work. It's an idea, and the only way that they could actually do it was to try it.
That is right. Now, Olmsted, Putnam properly should be termed one of the innovators of the paperback book. I think there were some, like all great ideas, there are several people working on this at about the same time, but he's certainly a person who one could rightfully claim was the first, and he was one of the innovators of the paperback book, a pioneer, and Olmsted, because Olmsted happened to be a neighbor, and just because paperback, one of the things that from the very get-go about them was it was possible to explore topics more quickly and topics that were different than one might explore in a more permanent, in that era, hardbound book. And so, he was looking for all kinds of different things, and Olmsted had recently taken this walking tour, and so Putnam signed him up to write a paperback about it.
Hey, it just goes to show you that the old adage is very true. It is not always what you know, but who you know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now his writing career is not just limited to that. In addition to a history degree, I also have a degree in political science, and he makes his mark in the political science work, in the political science world, intentionally or unintentionally, depending entirely on how you want to look at it. You talked about his idealism, his desire for social activism. Eventually, when he takes the job with that soon-to-be famous newspaper and starts doing all those little articles that eventually develop into the Cotton Kingdom, which turns out to be a linchpin to the Civil War, that is no small thing by itself. So give us the nutshell version of that, because I know that's something that most of our listeners aren't familiar with, and it just goes to show you that you don't necessarily know where your writing career is going to take you.
Sure. Now, what happened in Olmsted's case was, as I mentioned, he had all these professions he tried out. Farming was the one that was really starting to take, but then he had the chance to write this paperback book, and all of a sudden it kind of whet his appetite for writing. And then farming started, for restless Olmsted, farming started to look less attractive. Now, about this time, there was a startup newspaper, brand new newspaper called the New York Daily Times, and it would later drop the Daily and become merely the New York Times. And the New York Times was looking for content, looking for people to do breaking stories and stories that were of great import, particularly because this was the era when most major cities, a city like New York City, had about a dozen dailies. And so this brand new paper had to figure out how to carve out a niche and really deliver some pretty impressive reportage in a hurry. So the New York Times, their editor was a guy named Henry Raymond, and he decided that he wanted to dispatch a reporter who would travel through the American South and report extensively on the region. Well, Olmsted learned about this, and he applied for this job at the startup New York Times. He had a 5-minute interview with Henry Raymond, and he was handed this amazing gig. And you might think he sounds kind of underqualified. I mean, he's written this paperback book about farming. But one of the things that made Raymond very intent on sending Olmsted to the South was Olmsted had background as a farmer. And the South in this era was nothing if not an agrarian society. Also, in the course of that 5-minute interview, Olmsted showed one of the things that Raymond was most intent on, and that was Olmsted was not a diehard abolitionist, neither was he a sympathizer for slavery, and this was perfect. Even from the very outset, the New York Times wanted to be, part of its mandate was to be a kind of balanced paper, and so Henry Raymond, the Times editor, did not want to send a diehard abolitionist whose mind was already made up, nor a slavery sympathizer down to do this Southern reporting. So Olmsted, by virtue of being a farmer and also being open-minded, as it were, on the issue of slavery, he got sent off on this gig, and he left in the autumn of 1852, and he just proved to be a spectacular reporter. He did 48 dispatches for the New York Times. He went everywhere and he talked to everyone. He talked to plantation owners, he talked to slaves, he talked to poor white farmers. He produced this amazing series of dispatches that helped put the New York Times on the map. One of the things that makes his dispatches so incredibly powerful is that in the course of traveling through the South, Olmsted ultimately came to the conclusion that slavery was evil, but it wasn't some kind of idea that he'd hatched, off in some distant northern land, as was the case with so many abolitionists. He had firsthand experience. He was on the ground, seeing slavery, seeing plantations, witnessing what a terrible, terrible institution slavery was, and so that gave his reporting an authenticity, a verisimilitude that really made for powerful stuff.
Okay, now I've got a question for you because you're a journalist yourself. Now, some people are just wired to be that way, and I've got a copy of The Cotton Kingdom over here on my shelf. It's something I've had since my college days, and you can see the evolution of his thinking as you go through the articles. But he does maintain a high degree of objectivity, and once you know that this is him and there's no college training there, then it makes you wonder what he could have done with today's kind of training, because, like I said, some people are just wired for it and they can do it naturally, and he seems to have had that knack.
I think Olmsted, one of the best examples the world's ever produced of someone whose college was life itself, and he'd been living life, sort of wide open, noticing things, observing things, synthesizing things from an early age. And so when he had the opportunity to travel through the South, he ate it up. I mean, one of the things, and he ate it up, and he was thinking about it in new and surprising ways. For example, one of the real an idea that Olmsted particularly gets credit for is he came to the conclusion not only was slavery evil in his estimation, but he also noticed it was just a preposterously inefficient system from an economic standpoint. Olmsted had been a farmer by training, so when he went down and actually witnessed these farms, he saw how silly this was. I mean, slaves that were younger than, say, 12, they couldn't do much farm work, but the slaveholders had to feed and clothe them nonetheless. Old slaves couldn't do much farm work, but they had to be fed nonetheless. Sick slaves couldn't do much farm work. And so Olmsted came to the conclusion that a plantation was about a third as efficient as the northern farms that he'd worked and was familiar with. And so this was just a good example of how Olmsted, a person who really, because he didn't have any particular formal training that would have caused him to see things through a narrow prism, he came at things with a very open mind, and often allowed him to make surprising observations and connections. And certainly his travels through the South produced a lot of that kind of observation.
So do you think it's possible that if there had been no Civil War that he would have gone on to be a journalist?
I think he would have actually, if there hadn't been a panic of 1857, he might have stayed a journalist. All the Civil War really did for Olmsted was gave him yet another, sent him down yet another eddy, because he'd already done Central Park before the Civil War, and in fact the Civil War represented a real interruption. Certainly during the Civil War, no cities wanted to do landscape architecture projects, so we can certainly talk about it in more detail. But Olmsted went off and had a kind of another of his diversions or eddies that he traveled down during that time. But really, the thing that made Olmsted, the thing that caused Olmsted to make the transition from being a journalist to becoming a landscape architecture was one of the worst economic disasters of U.S. history, certainly worse than anything that people have had to deal with recently, which was the Panic of 1857. He lost his job in journalism. He was completely unemployed, and he had to find work, and he found work in a very, very modest capacity. He was hired to be the superintendent who'd be clearing this piece of land on a really scruffy piece of land in the middle of, or clearing this really scruffy piece of land in the middle of Manhattan that was very prosaically named for where it was. It was called Central Park, and it was a planned park in New York City. But at that point, at the point which Olmsted was hired, someone else was supposed to design Central Park, and Olmsted's very modest job was simply to clear the piece of land and knock down shanties and drain swamps to prepare the piece of land for someone else's design.
I can see, as I was reading your book, I could see this from his point of view, and I could see that as he walked onto the job site, he was probably one of only just a very small number of people who could see the potential of what he was about to do. And I could imagine how just in the space of a few short minutes his perspective changes. On the one hand, he thinks that, hey, I'm here for the job, I need the money, I want to eat. But then all of a sudden it's great guacamole. There's this opportunity to do this really big thing.
No, that's exactly right. Well, I don't know. When he was hired, I think he just thought it was probably a stopgap. And he was actually working on a book about the South at that point, part of what would ultimately become The Cotton Kingdom, the book that you referred to earlier, the classic book that's been in print since 1861. But I think when Olmsted, certainly in my read of it, when Olmsted took this very modest job as superintendent, I really think he expected that nothing more would happen. It was very clear that someone else would be designing Central Park. Probably didn't even occur to him. He certainly loved land, but in his case, in the midst of a terrible economic depression, he was simply taking a job that was available, and this job, what it called upon him to do was to clear the land. It wasn't a very glamorous or exciting job, and I would guess, particularly because Olmsted was continued at night when he wasn't draining swamps at night, he continued to work on his book, and so I think he probably expected that when the economy stabilized and when jobs became available again, he would return to journalism. But of course, some other events intervened, and all of a sudden, Olmsted had the opportunity to do something much more glamorous than clearing the land, and that sent him off, of course, in this entirely new direction.
So when did he achieve, if I'm wrong then, when does he achieve his appreciation for what he can do with Central Park?
What happens is a guy named Calvert Vaux learns about the fact that there's a plan for Central Park. Calvert Vaux is one of the few people in America at this point. He's an immigrant from England who's trained as an architect. He learns that there's a plan for Central Park. He takes a look at the plan, and he is disgusted. He cannot believe how amateurish this plan is. And Vaux had friends in high places. He'd actually, as a trained architect, he designed the Fifth Avenue mansion of one of the board members of the future Central Park. So Vaux started going to the board and saying, this is a really, really amateurish plan you have in the works here. You should scrap it. And Vaux said further, he said, in England, where I'm from, if you want to get the best plan, you hold a public design competition. Well, the board had listened to Vaux, and it announced a public design competition. Now, at that point, Vaux sought out Olmsted to see if Olmsted wanted to join him for this public competition. And Vaux didn't care about the fact that Olmsted was this, distinguished journalist. That really meant nothing to Vaux in this context. The reason Vaux wanted to be partners with Olmsted was because Olmsted had been out on this scruffy piece of land. He'd been knocking down shanties and draining swamps, and so Vaux thought, hey, this guy literally knows the lay of the land. What Vaux hadn't bargained on was what amazing. Once Olmsted wasn't just doing this modest job clearing the land. Once Olmsted was Vaux's partner in this public design competition, all of a sudden Olmsted just came bubbling up with all these amazing ideas, and they came up with a design for Central Park. There were 32 different contestants for the design competition. 33 contestants for the design competition. Olmsted and Vaux just trounced their 32 competitors, and their design was instantly seen as the design for Central Park. And so at that point, Olmsted was ready to set off on his life's work.
I can certainly believe it. So with that under his belt, there seems to be no doubt in my mind that his vision of his future begins to crystallize.
It did. I mean, Olmsted, Central Park. He fell in love with it. He fell in love with the project. He fell in love with the work. He loved everything about it. And to him, it was an amazing project. I mean, he and Vaux were working on a huge 850-acre canvas and creating, a beautiful place in New York City. Furthermore, he was finally, in his estimation, able to really, really attend to that generational, that 1840s desire to be a social reformer, because now he was creating a space in a crowded city where people could mix and mingle, where people of all different backgrounds could mix, where immigrants who are new to this country could go and become kind of acclimated to the United States. So it suited every single desire that he had. And furthermore, he got accolades like you would not believe. I mean, it was kind of equivalent almost to, Central Park was reviewed, and it was treated in the reviews the way someone would treat, a new symphony by Beethoven, or a work by Dickens. I mean, it was hailed in the Atlantic magazine, and Olmsted's former employer, the New York Times, and all kinds of different places. It was hailed as a just towering masterpiece. And so for Olmsted, this was extremely satisfying work, extremely fulfilling work. It was work that he began in 1858, right on the heels of the the Panic of 1857, and Central Park would take some years to be designed. And of course, what happens in 1861? While Olmsted and Vaux have a lot of the work on Central Park done, they certainly have a blueprint, a plan for the park in 1861. While Olmsted is in the midst of executing that, the Civil War breaks out.
Now, as I remember it off the top of my head, I can't remember the quote exactly, but you quote Olmsted in your book as having said that Central Park was a democratic ideal of the highest order or something like that. So
that's why he said it, he described it as a democratic achievement of the highest significance.
So now, how old was he at that point?
He was, I believe he was 39. But that's you might want to consult the book on that one, because I've forgotten.
There's a lot of us that don't know, really. I mean, our own futures don't crystallize until we're 40 and 45. So even still to this day, what happens to him in terms of his personal and professional development isn't really that unusual. I mean, I've known plenty of people who, by the age of 45, have been through a dozen different career fields, and it wasn't necessarily because they wanted to try a lot of things. It was just because they went to work for a lot of different people who went bankrupt, and they just kept going and going and going because they were persistent, but eventually they finally found something that stuck. So in his particular case, things finally crystallized for him at age 39, 40, and he now knows where he wants to go, and that pesky Civil War gets in his way, and it was a big speed bump for everybody, but it gives him a chance to fulfill more of his abolitionist interests, and it gives him a chance to make additional contributions to the future of the nation. Really, I don't think that anybody would have expected. I mean, when you look at his resume at that point, and think about what he's going to do with the United States Sanitary Commission, you would almost not connect the two.
So very true. Now, one of the interesting things about Olmsted, as the Civil War was in the offing, was he was not only interested as he was designing Central Park. He wasn't just interested in the artistic design. He also became really fascinated by administration. And Central Park was a giant public works project. Sometimes as many as 4,000 people were employed. And so Olmstead became very good at administration. It was something that in the time, interestingly enough, there are actually articles. I mean, the kind of article that would appear in Fortune magazine today about how Central Park was being administered, how teams of construction workers were being overseen. It was very, it was a very cutting edge project of the time. And so Olmstead developed a reputation, a nationwide reputation, not only as a park designer, the designer of Central Park, but also as a talented administrator. So lo and behold, the Civil War breaks out, and Olmstead wants to be involved, and so Olmstead gets the opportunity to head up a medical unit called the United States Sanitary Commission, completely so far afield from park making, this medical unit. But the reason, it's kind of an all-hands-on-deck situation. I mean, the Civil War is just broken out. There isn't so much time to sit there and think, oh, does this person fit exactly into this particular job? And so in Olmstead's case, he had this reputation as a talented administrator. There's a need for someone to administer, to head up this Civil War era, this new medical outfit. So Olmsted's handed the job, and Olmstead, again, as he has throughout his life, he brings all kinds of unusual and innovative ideas to this. He winds up being an incredibly talented administrator, and this medical unit just provided untold aid to wounded soldiers during the Civil War. It was at all the major battles. Olmstead was at all the major battles, or at least after all the major battles, helping with the wounded, whether we're talking Antietam, Gettysburg, and so on. And after the Civil War was over, through a whole series of convolutions, this outfit that Olmstead headed up kind of morphed into the beginnings of the American Red Cross.
That's not that's not too bad for a guy who's pretty good at organization and has no formal medical training. That is no small thing. But he leaves Washington, D.C. Very unhappy because he doesn't like politics, but they're just not going to let him go, are they?
No, they actually, the Battle of Gettysburg was kind of it was a watershed, obviously, in the Civil War, and it was at that point it was kind of clear that the North was going to emerge victorious, the South was going to lose, and it kind of became an issue of how long it was going to take and what the terms are going to be. Well, Olmstead, by this time, the Civil War had been going on for a couple of years, and Olmstead, is a restless guy. He also found that the outfit that he headed up, the United States Sanitary Commission, was starting to become larger and more unwieldy, and had a large board and all kinds of far-flung, outposts and so forth. And so Olmstead was finding it more and more difficult to manage. He was getting all kinds of blowback from the members of the board. And so in typical Olmstead fashion, he started to become frustrated. He thought the United States Sanitary Commission was kind of on even footing. He felt like at this point it had become just sort of a maintenance task. And so he started casting about once again. In fact, one of the things that caused Olmstead to cast about halfway through the Civil War was he perceived pretty soon the Civil War would be ending and he needed a job. And as you might imagine, he certainly wasn't able, any feelers he put out for landscape architecture fell on deaf ears, because it's the middle of the Civil War. No city was going to design a park. So instead, at the tail end of the Civil War, Olmstead had yet another job. He went out to California and became the supervisor of a kind of legendary gold mine or gold mining operation.
So he goes out there and he manages the Mariposa estate, but at what point in his timeline is he involved in the Washington Mall project?
Olmstead designed the Capitol grounds.
The Capitol grounds. That's what I'm thinking of right there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll jump forward to that quickly, or I'll figure out a way to. Olmstead was out in California. He headed up this gold mine, and in classic Olmstead fashion, while heading up a gold mine, Yosemite Valley was about 30 miles away, and Olmstead started visiting repeatedly, and he was just enchanted. This was a time when Yosemite was very, very isolated. Maybe, according to one account I came across, only maybe 500 non-Native Americans ever even entered Yosemite at this point. So in typical kind of serendipity, Olmstead goes out, becomes the supervisor of a gold mine, but starts becoming intrigued with nearby and very isolated Yosemite. So he starts visiting repeatedly, and he starts making a call for Yosemite to be preserved for posterity. And it's kind of amazing. I mean, this is at a time when hardly anybody had even visited, but Olmsted predicted that at some point in the future, he would get 1 million visitors in a year, which was very prescient. That would happen in the 1950s, but already Olmsted perceived, it's only a matter of time before civilization started encroaching Yosemite, and he thought the federal government should be involved, should step in and preserve this place. And again, that was very prescient. It was about 50 years before the National Park Service even existed. But once the Civil War ended, all of a sudden, the peace, all of a sudden all these communities, all these cities around the country started clamoring for landscape work. Vaux, his old partner, landed some prime commissions, such as Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Vaux started saying to Olmsted, what are you doing, wasting your time out in California, heading up a gold mine and poking around Yosemite? Why don't you come back east and join me in this big book of work I'm putting together? And so Olmsted reconnected with Vaux, his partner, returned east from California, and from that point forward, from 1865 forward, Olmsted, because of demand, quite literally, became a landscape architect almost exclusively and was called upon to do a whole series of classic designs around the country, including the Capitol grounds in Washington, D.C.
That's something I knew about. I knew that he had done that, but a large part of his body of work was, for the most part, unknown to me.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
I'm curious to know, where does the title of this book come from? What inspired you to call this thing Genius of Place?
Genius of place is an ancient term. It actually goes back to Latin, genius loci. I probably abused the pronunciation there. I'm sure my high school Latin teacher wouldn't be happy. But genius loci, later translated into genius of place, a term that was used by many people over the years, most notably the poet Alexander Pope. What it meant was draw out the essence of a place. And so Olmsted loved this phrase, and he would use it often in conversation, and he would use it often also in his written reports. He would say, I intend to draw out the genius of this place. And what that meant was, what he was offering was whatever the landscape was, whether it was the grounds of the U.S. Capitol, a person's private estate, a woodland park, a hillside park, whatever it might be, Olmsted's notion was that the best way to be a landscape architect was not to sort of recreate the wheel, as it were, but rather to try to take a look at a piece of land, try to kind of glean what its essence was, and then take that essence and kind of bolster it, make it in a way more natural than nature itself. That was called Genius of Place, the Genius of Place, and I thought it was a kind of resonant title because I thought Olmsted himself was a genius of place.
I can see how you would be inspired by that. And at some point in these interviews, I always go for something that's relatively obscure within the book. It's just my way of kind of proving that I read the thing. And there's one small detail in Olmsted's timeline that strikes a chord with me as a historian and as a writer. And as a writer of fiction, which I do as a sideline when I'm not here busy doing the show, after Olmsted breaks away from Vaux, after they dissolve their partnership and he goes on his way, one of the things that you mention is that one of the first business undertakings that he does on his own is to do the landscaping for the asylum that he will eventually end his life in. And as a historian, there is an irony and a symmetry there that is just absolutely impossible to beat. So as we come into the final minutes of the program, there really isn't enough time here to do justice to the full scope and scale of all the landscaping work that this guy did, because he did the great estates and he's done university campuses and the like. And it seems almost morbid to finish the conversation on this kind of note, but I want to come back full circle to his type of genius. Do we have any idea today what condition he suffered from. Was it Alzheimer's or Parkinson's?
I think ultimately he probably suffered from some kind of senile dementia. Now, I should mention that throughout Olmstead's life, he suffered all kinds of tumultuous mental states, and probably, he was someone who he'd have long periods of depression, followed by he'd often just lie on the couch, just immobile, and then he'd spring forward and just be superhumanly productive for a stretch, and then he'd slip back into depression again. Well, there's a pretty clear modern diagnosis for that. It's bipolar disorder. So chances are Olmstead was bipolar, and like many bipolar people, particularly untreated ones, he had a tumultuous life, but also a very productive life. Now, late in life, he started to show various symptoms that are consistent with Alzheimer's disease, some kind of senile dementia. Of course, there wasn't a diagnosis in this era, but he did some strange things, including he became often befuddled. He forgot things, forgetful, agitated. It was a really clear sign to his family that he was really going downhill when he punched the family horse. Olmstead had always been very kind to animals, and for some bizarre reason, he took a swing at the family horse. And so it became clear that something was quite wrong with him. As I said, likely some kind of senile dementia, perhaps Alzheimer's. His condition got progressively worse, and he was ultimately checked into an asylum where he spent his last years.
I'm still here. Tell us what happened to his child, Charlotte, and is there any indicator there that his condition was hereditary?
Sure. Olmstead had a child named Charlotte was always described as being kind of hysterical, and it was, this as a modern person, the descriptions of Charlotte are, there's certainly an element of gender biases of the 19th century. Charlotte was a woman, and she was always described as being hysterical and going off at the drop of the hat and so forth. She was clearly mentally ill. She spent almost her entire adult life from her early 20s on in a mental institution. I think there probably was some hereditary component there. Olmstead, by virtue of being a man, got benefit for simply being manic, driven, feverish, whatever you might want to call it. Charlotte, as a woman, was merely hysterical. So it's hard to exactly line up their symptoms, but what you could say with certainty is both people, and it's probably hereditary, had mental issues.
Okay, so now once we upload this podcast to the internet, it lives forever. So with future generations in mind who are going to listen to this audio recording through whatever neural interface or holographic system that they use in the 22nd or 23rd centuries, what do you want to say about Frederick Law Olmstead to future generations of researchers who are going to look back on things like your book as possibly someday some form of ancient history?
Well, speaking to those of the future, hopefully the incredible parks that Olmstead designed are still intact. And one thing that's wonderful is here in 2013 at least, these parks from 2 centuries ago, from the 19th century, they're remarkably intact, and we're talking about parks ranging everywhere from New York Central Park and Prospect Park to a park system in Boston, the Emerald Necklace, to Milwaukee's park system, to Louisville's park system, on and on down the line. One of the reasons that these parks are in such remarkably good shape is because this was just Olmstead was the right person at the right time. This was a time many wise cities during the 19th century recognized, or wise city elders recognized, that this was sort of a last chance to carve out a piece of land in the middle of the city, or sometimes on the outskirts of the city, but what would soon be kind of developed around. This was kind of a last chance. I mean, Manhattan's a great example. If Central Park had not been designed, Manhattan would have easily just filled in with prime real estate. Likewise, a city like Milwaukee, Buffalo, all the different cities Olmstead worked in, thankfully, the city was the right man in the right place. And so during the 19th century, these pieces of land were set aside. And because his designs were so spectacular, people didn't think, oh, let's sell this piece of valuable real estate. This is kind of an ugly park. It'd be better served by by an apartment complex or what have you. Thanks to Olmstead's beautiful designs, these pieces of land endured and continue to endure. And what's wonderful is a lot of them are right in the middle of cities. They're right in the inner cities, often serving very diverse populations. Had Olmstead not carved out this land, had Olmstead not done these brilliant designs on this land carved out when it was, these cities would have filled in and this opportunity would have been lost. So I guess for the sake of posterity, it's been wonderful that Olmsted's parks are so well designed that they remain in many cases well intact into the 21st century. I hope that will carry into the future.
Okay, so let's wrap by telling people where they can get in touch with you.
Sure. Well, I have a website, which is Justin Martin and the number 1, allpushedtogether.com, and you can actually send me a message off that, and I'm happy to hear from you or respond. I also have a Facebook page for the book, which is facebook.com/Olmstead Book Pushed Together. You can also find it just by going on Facebook and looking on the book's title, and that's also a way to I periodically post pictures of various parks and projects, which hopefully people will enjoy. It's also a way to reach me if someone's so inclined.
And that is a wrap. We've come to the end of another very fast, full-hour episode. Please find us online at politicsandpatriotism.com, where you can download all of our episodes for free from the RSS feed, or you can go to the iTunes store and download all of our episodes for free, or you can go to Stitcher.com and download the free Stitcher app, and through the Stitcher Smart Radio Network, hear all of our new and upcoming episodes as they air from your smartphone, your tablet, or your laptop computer, wherever you happen to be on planet Earth. So on behalf of everyone here at the show, thank you for your time and have a good day.